So this is the first of 4 photosynthesis talks, and this one's mainly going to be kind of an intro to photosynthesis. So let's first talk about the energy needs of life. There's 2 kind of main categories which you're probably familiar with. One is autotrophs, and these are the guys that can actually make their own food. They don't need to depend on eating, whatever that may mean for that organism, eating another organism. They don't need to do that. They can make it themselves within their own body, per se. These are known as the producers. So biotic is living, and then producers, meaning living producers that can make their own food. There's kind of 2 main types of ways: photoautotrophs versus chemoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs use solar energy, which is what we're most familiar with. Chemoautotrophs can actually use chemical energy to make their own food. They just convert one chemical energy into the chemical energy that they need in their body. We're most familiar with plants, of course. They provide a lot of our nutrient intake as well as our oxygen and all that stuff. So those are the producers we're most familiar with. There's also protists that can be producers, such as algae, and then plankton. There's also bacteria that can be photosynthetic as well. So it's not just plants out there that are kind of providing this beginning part of the food chain here. On the other hand, we have heterotrophs like us, and we are the biotic consumers. So we're the living consumers. We have to obtain our food by actually eating some other type of organism or their byproducts, such as the case for decomposers like these little mushrooms over here. So just be, again, familiar with autotrophs versus heterotrophs. So let's talk a little bit about the plant structure in general and how they get these kind of raw materials that are needed to do photosynthesis. So, of course, they need sunlight, and that's mainly done by the leaves of the plant. They're kind of the little solar collectors, as shown here. They're like little solar panels that soak in all that light energy. So that's where the plant gets the sunlight. CO2 is taken in by these things called stomatas, and they're just basically little pores. There's not a very good picture here, but there will be in upcoming talks about photosynthesis. But they're just little pores, mainly on the bottom of the leaf, so on the underside of the leaf, where the pores can kind of open and close, and there's gas exchange and water exchange through these pores. So CO2 that's floating around the atmosphere can actually enter into the plant through these pores called stomatas. So we got sunlight, CO2, and H2O is the third thing that's needed for photosynthesis. And this, of course, is taken up from the roots and the soil. So the roots will soak up water from the soil, and again, like we learned from transpiration, will travel up the plant, and then eventually will transpire or evaporate out of the leaves. So here's kind of the 3 main things with photosynthesis: light, CO2, and H2O, and the different parts of the plants that are actually involved in kind of obtaining these raw materials for photosynthesis. Of course, the plant also needs nutrients, okay, like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium, iron, just certain nutrients that they need to keep things going at the cellular level. And these are as well taken up from the roots along with the H2O. So the soil will contain all of these nutrients that are actually replenished back in the soil from decomposers, decomposing dead organisms. So again, that's kind of cycle of matter through living systems. Okay, here's a little bit more kind of zoomed in of how the leaves kind of work. Here's the stomata that I talked about, these little pores. These are mesophyll cells, and these mesophyll cells have a bunch of chloroplasts in there. So this is kind of the sites of photosynthesis. So again, these mesophyll cells are here. You get the gas exchange through the stomata. CO2 can go in, O2 can go out. If you look specifically at the chloroplasts, it's a double membrane, just like the mitochondria. You got a double membrane, you got an outer and inner membrane, and then you have this intermembrane space, which is the space in between. And then inside of the inner membrane, which would be the very middle, you have the stroma, which is kind of just the space. And then you have these thylakoids, which are these like little coin stacked looking things. And these thylakoids are where photosynthesis, the light-dependent reactions are going to happen. The stroma is where the light-independent reactions, the Calvin cycle, is going to happen. And then the pigment responsible for kind of this uptake of the sunlight, or I guess the absorption of the sunlight, is going to be chlorophyll. This is where you get that green color of plants. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about the light spectrum. All right. So here is the equation for photosynthesis. Again, you got carbon dioxide and water as well as light. Light should be kind of on here as well. That's the energy that's going to be used for this process. So these are our reactants. Here are our products. So the plant is going to produce sugar, and it's also going to produce oxygen. And then you do get some heat, of course. Okay, the laws of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics states that you always kind of have this increase in disorder by this release of heat. So you always lose heat with any kind of chemical reaction. I also want to point out too that this is a balanced equation. I want you to keep that in mind. I know this goes back to chemistry, but it's balanced. It needs to be balanced. That's why there's 6 carbon dioxide, 6 waters, 1 sugar, and 6 oxygens. If you add up all the individual elements, they will be balanced. So here you got 6 carbons on this side. So here's the only place we have carbons. There's 6 of them. And on this side, here's the only place you have carbon. There's 6 of them. We can do the same for each element. There's going to be the same exact number of oxygens on both sides and the same exact number of hydrogens on both sides. Remember, they need to be balanced. Okay, there's 2 main reactions in photosynthesis. There's the light reaction, which is going to take place in the thylakoid, and we will kind of go into more depth with both of these reactions. But the light reaction happens in these stacks here called thylakoids. The main point of the light reaction is to produce these 2 molecules. It is super important because these are 2 energy molecules that are going to drive the second part of the photosynthesis reaction, which is the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, and it absolutely needs ATP and NADPH for this wheel to spin. Okay, that's a very simplified version. A wheel doesn't actually spin, but for this reaction to occur, it needs these 2 energy molecules. So the whole purpose of the light reaction is to make these 2 molecules. Okay, please remember that. All right, and we're going to go in more depth with both of these, but for right now, just understand the light reaction makes ATP and NADPH. That's going to allow the Calvin cycle to occur, and the Calvin cycle is what's going to produce that sugar, which is really the end product for plants for photosynthesis. They're just trying to make their food. But the Calvin cycle can't make this sugar unless it has these 2 energy molecules that are made from the light reaction. So the whole point of light being absorbed in the light reaction is to make ATP and NADPH. Okay. Also, a kind of good way to remember photosynthesis and the 2 types of reactions. Photo is the light reaction. It requires the solar energy. And synthesis is the synthesis part. That's where we're actually going to synthesize the sugar. So you can kind of remember the 2 cycles here just by breaking down the photosynthesis word. Photosynthesis. Okay, so let's talk about light a little bit. So from the sun, we get a variety of wavelengths of light. Okay, this is what we're most familiar with, is this visible light, which with all of it shining down just is white light. You can actually use different things, scientific ways, to actually separate out individual wavelengths of light. But when we talk about white light, we're talking about the entire visible light spectrum that includes all of these colors of the rainbow. Okay, the Roy G. Biv. So why is chlorophyll green? Well, this pigment, chlorophyll, that's found in the chloroplasts, it actually absorbs all wavelengths of light except for green. So green is actually reflected. That's why you see the green color. But all of the other wavelengths are absorbed. Some are absorbed more than others, but that's why you see this kind of green reflection off of chloroplasts, because of the chlorophyll and the different wavelengths that it absorbs versus reflects. So you can actually do this in a lab setting where they can use this prism, okay, that separates all the wavelengths, and then you can use this kind of thing that will have a slit in it where you can just kind of focus in on certain wavelengths here. So in this experiment, they are focusing in on the blue, so they're letting through the blue wavelength of light. through this chlorophyll solution. So it's just basically a solution. Who knows what's been used? It could be spinach. You just break it all down and you can isolate all this chlorophyll. And they can see how much of it actually goes through and how much is absorbed. And you can see that this line right here is a lot bluer than this line, showing that a lot of the blue is being absorbed and only some of it is still coming through. And then this is just kind of a detector that can detect how much of it is coming through. Okay? And that indicates that the chlorophyll is absorbing a lot of that blue. So this is the best word to use in this scenario. It is absorbing the blue wavelength. Okay? It absorbs blue light. On the other hand, if we move this slit so that green light comes through, you can see, if you compare the color here to the color here, that most of the green light is still coming through. So it's being reflected. None of it, well, not none of it, but most of it is not being absorbed. Most of it is being reflected. And we can see that with the detector, that it's detecting quite a bit of the green light. You can see that this kind of indicator here shoots up, whereas with the blue, it's way down here. So this high transmittance is indicating that a lot of the green is coming through and it's not being absorbed. It's actually being reflected. Okay? Okay, I'm just going to introduce you to this really quick. We will go into this in more detail in the next section. But this is looking more deeply into the chloroplasts, where they have these little chlorophyll pigments. And each of these pigments is kind of its own little solar panel. And they kind of group together in something called a photosystem. Okay, and this photosystem is just going to collect the sunlight energy. So the photons from the sunlight come down and they hit these little solar panels, or these pigments, these chlorophyll pigments. And when that happens, there's going to be electrons available, and we'll talk about that. But it excites these electrons, and these electrons just kind of hopscotch along these pigments. And there's going to be one pigment in this photosystem that's going to be it's called the reaction center, but it's going to be kind of the collector of all the electrons. Okay, you can kind of think of these things as antenna, and that's what they're called, as antenna pigment molecules. They kind of take in the photons from the sunlight, and these electrons kind of bounce along the antenna pigments until they reach the reaction center. And then this is what's going to be involved in this electron transfer. And this part, we're going to have an electron transport chain that's going to be here that we'll talk about next lesson. Okay, but right now you need to understand that there are photosystems that collect the sunlight, and that's where the electrons will be transferred into the electron transport chain. There are two photosystems in every electron transport chain. There's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Yes, it seems backward. For whatever reason, photosystem 2 comes before photosystem 1 in the chain. Again, we'll talk about this more. I'm not going to go into details here. Right now, you just need to know that there are two photosystems. There's two collections of solar panels here. All right? And this is going to be involved in the light reaction, okay, because we're talking about light right now. Well, where are these photosystems? Well, they're in the membrane, okay? They're in the membrane of the thylakoids, all these little stacks. Because remember, the electron transport chain has to be on a membrane because we need to get that hydrogen gradient that's going to spin that wheel to make the ATP, which if you don't know what that means, you will know next lesson. But basically what you need to know right now is this electron transport chain and these photosystems are in the membrane of the thylakoid. Why do we have so many thylakoids? Why do we have so much membrane? It goes back to what we've talked so much about, which is surface area. We got tons of membrane for this electron transport to happen. Okay, tons of membrane with all these stacked thylakoids. So that's where the photosystems are located, or in these membranes. That's where the light's going to be taken in. That light energy is going to be used to power this electron transport chain, which is going to give us those two things we need from the light cycle, ATP and NADPH. ATP and NADPH, that's the two main things that come out of the light cycle that are going to be used to power the Calvin cycle. Okay? All right, so now if you can take some time, just get some scrap paper or a half sheet of paper or something and kind of go through your notes and answer this synthesis question. If you're in class right now, turn it in. If not, it might be good practice at home. And if you have any questions, please ask.